And I think we're ready to go now.
Okay.
Don't forget to tell everyone about the tournament coming up.
Well, I know we've got a lot of phenology volunteers out there and there'd be interest to them. Can you get Bobby for me?
Way ahead of you. He's actually ready right now.
Okay, thanks. Well, let's go straight to Bobby Butler at Glacier Park with some exciting news.
This is Bobby Buttercup Butler reporting to you from beautiful Glacial Park today for the 35th Annual International Tournament of Plant Phenology. For the new folks, phenology is all about the seasonal development of plants and animals. Well, this is phenology's big week. Hundreds of phenologists from around the world will scour the county day and night, and whoever records the most photo-verified start bloom observations will be declared the premier, unbelievably popular phenologist of the year. They call it the puppy, and they all want to hold it at the end of the week. Oh, sorry, wrong picture. Take a moment, folks. Can you feel it? Every buxom bud, every trembling twig, every timidly tapering taproot, every radical root hair is quivering with anticipation. The plants are anxiously awaiting the sly secret seasonal signal to flower. Oh my, the buzz is in the air this year that Curly Doc Collins' 35-year-old record could fall. Curly famously collapsed after recording his last species mere seconds before the final bell. Unfortunately, Curly never fully recovered from the physical and psychological stress of that week, spending his last years wandering the parks with a piece of paper and pencil in his hands. Here's former champion, Lucky Actress Lucas. Can we have a word with you, Lucky?
Yeah, sure.
Lucky, you've been here for the last 10 big weeks. What do you think are the chances of a record this year?
You know, the legend of Curly Collins gets bigger every year, but I think we got a chance to break that record.
How's that, Lucky?
I went by Curly's grave in Ringwood. I do that each year before the big week starts, to pay my respects. Talk to Curly, get his advice.
You talked to Curly?
Yeah, I even asked his advice before I married my first husband. That didn't work out so good, but he's always steered me straight on plants. So I'm standing there talking to Curly, and what should I see but Lamium purpureum. The purple dead nettle, blooming by the little cement puppy next to his stone. First time ever. I'm telling you, it's a sign.
Right. Lucky, you won the puppy in 2012 and 15. What's your strategy this year?
Well, I can't say too much. The thing of it is, Bob, your route is everything, really. I spent the last year fine-tuning my plans. The word is out that the bee-bone busybodies will be using drones again to follow the top competitors. So I intend to go to some out-of-the-way places and change my disguise, just to throw them off. You can't be too careful.
And that explains the photo from last year with you dressed as Cinderella.
Yeah, but I thought I looked nice in that dress. But it was tough getting through that marsh. I lost one of my glass slippers in the mud.
It's too bad, Lucky. And you were arrested wearing a gorilla costume at Marengo Ridge, weren't you? A mother there claimed you frightened her children.
Yeah, but to be fair, I thought they were the bees following me, so I howled and chased them off. Nothing much. They were kids. The whole thing got blown way out of proportion. I spent 48 hours in police custody and had to take a psychological examination before they would let me out. I could never catch up after that. I told the judges, but I was still wearing the gorilla suit and the one glass slipper, so I don't know if they believed me.
And Boris, the bog man of the bee-bone busybodies, took the puppy that year. Well, that's all for now from beautiful Glacial Park in Ringwood, Illinois. Feel it, folks? We're standing on the phenological precipice, the blooming brink, the overpowering, towering, flowering escarpment. The big week starts tomorrow.
Well, it's time to get started after that exciting announcement. So I'll leave it up to you whether the lazy refers to plants or to the summer. But we're going to talk about plants really that are blooming in the middle of summer. It's not an entirely arbitrary segment of blooming. Our workshop we did last spring on spring blooming plants gets this flowering peak. Now this line is a running average of the number of plants coming into bloom over the last 10 days. This is from our phenology program here at the Conservation District. And you can see there's a big surge in flowering to start the year, then it sags down. There's another surge in early summer, and then it goes down and we get, we'll do this with our next Tom Talk here in about 5 weeks. So we're really going to deal with this group of plants today, and sure, there are some of these plants here that flowering continues into this period, and so there's some overlap. We're trying to pick out about a little less than 70 plants that we find blooming during this time period. I'm not going to do a lot. I've got some opening slides here that really deal with plant structures and names, and I don't want to go over that again. I've done it with a spring flowering workshop last year and then a basic botany workshop. Just a few very basic things, and then I'll leave the rest of it for you to go through on the PDF that you can download later and go over that on your own. Flowers all evolved from an original flower somewhere over 100 million years ago, and it had four parts, and they're always in the same order: sepal, petal, stamen, pistil, or often called carpel. There's three different words that are used for this, the female part of the flower, but I'll tend to use either carpel or pistil, referring to the same thing. It's the female part of the flower in the center. The carpel can be simple, as in one carpel. The legume pod is an example of a simple carpel, a folded leaf, sealed on its edges. Or the center of the flower can actually have many carpels or pistils arranged on the receptacle, and the receptacle is simply the end of the stem. But always sepal, petal, stamen, and then the female part of the flower in the center. That's conserved in all flowers. And so whenever you see a flower and you're a bit confused to start with, always remember that order and you know where to look for things. I'm not going to go over all of this stuff, but we'll talk a little bit about inferior and superior ovaries. Classic flower, the diagram I just showed you, is the superior ovary, where sepal, petal, stamen all originate from the base of the pistil. We have a lot of flowers that are called inferior ovaries, where the sepal, petals, and stamen are fused together into a layer on the outside of the ovary and then become free parts only on top of the ovary. We'll mention that later. Likewise, I'll just use words bilaterally and radially symmetric, not the fancier terms to refer to flower symmetry. And I'll talk somewhat about fusion of parts. Sepals or petals can be fused together, or they can all be fused together. Stamens can be fused together either on the style, the long skinny part, or the anther. And we'll see that in the plants we do today. Leaf arrangements, I've gone over these with a woody plant workshop, so hopefully you know these, and I'll try to make it obvious when I use these terms later on today. Monocots and dicots, I know we've been over this one a couple of times before. Really look for the parallel vein leaves and monocots and flowers in parts of three parts, generally 3 sepals and 3 petals. And often those sepals and petals look alike, and we call them tepals. Whereas the dicots more typically have flower parts in 4s and 5s, and sort of net or feather veined leaf. Irises, one we'll do today. Beautiful example of a monocot, flower parts in 3s, and here we have a mayapple with I'm not quite sure how many flower parts there, but they're not in 3s, and here a sort of complex leaf, but you can see the feathery veination of the leaflets. We're going to start off. I'm going to have things organized by plant family today. I think we may do a workshop during the winter on plant families. It's something I like to emphasize when I'm working with plants and teaching, because for one thing, if you can recognize a plant family, you've got a big head start on figuring out what the species is. If you don't even know the plant family, you're sort of starting in the beginning of the book and going through so many couplets if you're keying, or you've got so many choices if you're looking through a flower book, that it's hard to find the answer. But if you can get it down to a plant family, you can really get much closer to the final answer, and then look at the right resources to get you to that final answer. So let's look at three flowers here, all in the genus Anemone in the buttercup family. And these all have 5 sepals, 5 petals, many stamens, and many pistils or carpels in the center, all free from one another. So, and the flowers, all of these 3 anemones, look very, very similar. It's really 3 different habitats. This is the one I see most often, just in moist meadows scattered around. It doesn't have to be even a remnant ecosystem. I've seen this growing. Just saw it a couple of days ago doing my phenology route, growing on the edge of an agricultural field. Whereas these are a little more restricted to higher quality natural areas, savanna barrens, more likely for the tall anemone and the thimbleweed and drier prairies. It's really the leaves that make them easy to tell apart. This one, notice the leaves are deeply divided, and here the divisions of the leaf all terminate here without a stalk. There's sessile on the central stalk of the flower, whereas the tall anemone has a long stalk, and so does the thimbleweed. Both of those have long stalked leaves, and all of those separate little carpels then mature into little achenes or nut-like fruits clustered together on the receptacle here. This much longer cluster with the thimbleweed somewhat shorter on the tall anemone, and then almost circular cluster of achenes on the meadow anemone. So these are somewhat easier to tell apart really by the leaves and fruits. This is an unusual member. The buttercup family has a lot of odd ones. It's not an easy family to recognize as some, though the genera sometimes are easy to recognize. Thalictrum is a strange member of the buttercup family because it's re-evolved wind pollination. All flowering plants began as insect pollinated. That was the whole reason for the invention, the biological invention of the flower, is putting male and female parts together to facilitate insect pollination. But some of them have re-evolved wind pollination. And you can see here that it's dioecious, so there are male and female individuals. These are the female flowers over here and the male flowers over here. So next time you see a Meadow Rue in flower, go over and take a look at it to see which you're looking at, the male or the female. Probably the easiest way to recognize these, the meadow, this is probably 4, 5, 6 feet tall when it's mature, grows out in open meadows and moist meadows and prairies. Is this many divided leaf here, and each leaflet has these characteristic little indentations in the margins. Fairly easy to recognize by its leaves. There is one sister species that is similar in every respect other than the underside of the leaf has short, stiff hairs and glands that give it a slight odor when crushed, and that's Thalictrum revolutum, the waxy meadow rue. Mostly when I see meadow rues in McHenry County, they're the dasycarpum, the purple meadow rue. Now let's go to the carrot family. This is an easy, I am told, this is the first plant family recognized by botanists centuries ago, the first plant family that still holds together today. And it's named for its umbels. This was for a long time called the umbelliferae because of this distinctive arrangement of tiny flowers in these umbels, and we'll look more exactly what an umbel is here in a moment. With wild carrot, probably the most common member of this plant family because it's a common weed. It's just all over the place in open meadows and roadsides, and often a weed early in prairie restorations. It typically doesn't hang around for a long time in competition with perennial plants, but sometimes you'll still find it scattered in a prairie restoration. One of the ways that it stands out from other umbellifers, members of that family, is this large red flower in the center of the cluster. But sometimes that's missing. And so it's not a 100% identification character. The leaves are very finely divided. This is the wild carrot. This is the progenitor of carrots you buy at the grocery store if you plant carrots in your garden and grow them. The leaves will look just like this, and if you let them go for 2 years, you'll harvest the carrot after 1 year. If you let it go for 2 years, it will have a flower that looks very much like the wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace flower. And this is an important one to learn because this is the wild carrot. Looks and smells exactly like, well, it looks similar to the carrots you buy in the store. It smells exactly like them. But I like to nibble on wild things, but this one has always seemed kind of stringy. Maybe if you cooked it, the right way, it would be more edible. And you can see that in its wild version, it had very little of the beta carotene that colors the domestic carrots, that beautiful orange color. This is the one, excuse me, this is an umbel. All of the stalks, and this is actually a compound umbel. This is a tiny mini umbel here. And an umbel is distinguished by the stalk of the flower or the petiole of the flower, or in this case of the mini umbel, all joined at a single point. Here is a mini umbel in which the stalks of each of the individual flowers join at a single point, all subtended by a group of bracts. So that's an umbel. We'll talk about a similar flowering structure called a corymb a little bit later on in the workshop today. This is one you definitely do not want to confuse it with. Now let's look at the leaf of the poison hemlock, and somewhat less finely divided than the wild carrot. And you're saying to yourself, these little mini umbels are more widely spaced and it doesn't have that dense spheric or circular appearance of the wild carrot, but that's highly variable. And lots of people make the mistake of confusing the two. They both have this white root. I've never smelled the root of a poison hemlock and whether it has that same vegetable odor of the carrot root. But this one's a deadly poison, and people are poisoned and killed every year by this plant, and people making the mistaking this for the wild carrot. So if you do like to nibble on wild things, you better learn to tell your plants apart very reliably, because this is one you don't want to bite into. This is the hemlock of Socrates fame. This one will kill you. And another member of this family, one that grows in the woods, is another introduced plant called the Japanese hedge parsley that seems to be very slowly increasing in the Chicago area. I'm told it's more of a problem in Kane County to the south, and I see it in most of our woods in McHenry County. But it's one to be on the lookout for. The umbel is somewhat smaller. The leaves are less finely divided than wild carrot, and it does grow in the woods, and neither poison hemlock nor wild carrot are very much woodland sorts of plants. They're more out in the open. Here you can see the little mini umbels. Most of the plants in the umbellifery, or more properly called today the Apiaceae, actually have compound umbels. Each of these is a tiny umbel joined together into a compound umbel. Wild parsnip is a super common member of the umbel or the carrot family. Here you can see again the compound umbel. And there's the characteristic leaf. And this is one to learn well. The flowers look very much like golden Alexander, which started blooming a little bit ahead of wild parsnip. We had that in our spring flowering workshop last year. The leaves are really quite different. And one thing I've noticed with, this is a characteristic of the family. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't any other plants in any other family that will occasionally do it. But all the umbellifers have this sheathing base of the leaf that partially or sometimes wholly wraps around the base or the stem where it attaches. I find that a very useful character as a clue to tell me I'm looking at something in the umbellifery. With these leaves, you can see that this leaf is angled upward, and yet the leaflets are turned relative to the axis of the leaf. The leaflets are turned as if to intercept more sunlight. And I find that a very distinctive character of the wild parsnip that really differentiates it along with some other characters from the golden Alexander. So whenever you think you're looking at golden Alexander, check the leaves. The leaves are really quite different. That character of the leaflet turning relative to the stalk is a character that I find pretty consistent. Now let's look at some things in the composite family. We'll have a lot of these. We'll have quite a few in midsummer in this workshop today, and a lot of them in the late summer. Very few of these flower in the springtime. One of my favorite introduced plants, it doesn't seem to become a problem in prairie restoration or in natural areas. It really frequents more sort of open old world meadows of cool season grasses along roadsides and sidewalks where they're not mowed. I don't know, maybe some of you have seen it as more of a problem weed. The leaves are quite distinctive. I would not really call that a compound leaf, more of a narrowly lobed leaf with sort of rounded lobes. And the composite flower head here has very, very tiny, many very tiny little disc flowers. Remember, the composite flower head has both disc flowers and ray flowers. The ray flowers are modified to look like the petals of a simple flower. The disc flowers are tiny little flowers in the center. And you can see here, and they always start flowering on the edges, and the wave of flowering moves toward the center. Here, this small insect is favoring those flowers right as they open, right at that margin between the flowers that have been open for a while and the ones that haven't opened in the center. So that's oxeye daisy, beautiful little weed that grows not so much in natural areas as in old world meadows, disturbed areas. Here's one that's easy to confuse with something in the umbel family because it has that white flat-topped inflorescence. But look a little bit closer and you'll see that it's not an umbel. Let's see if, yeah, it's a corum. Yeah, here is a picture. Now see how it's flat-topped, but the stalk of the flowers, they actually join together at different points. They come together in the end to form a flat-top inflorescence, but they don't join at a single point. And that's the difference between a corum and an umbel. And you'll see that each one of these, what would be a flower in a carrot family umbel, is actually a head of several flowers of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 10 little disc flowers, and then 4 or 5 ray flowers along the edges. So similar at first appearance, but on closer examination, quite different from things in the umbelliferæ. The finely dissected aromatic leaves are really distinctive even before it sends up its flowering stalk. Next time you see one, pick just a little part of the leaf and crush it and smell it. It doesn't smell like anything else in the plant world. The name Achillea comes from the fictional Greek hero of the Iliad and Odyssey, Achilles. In one telling of this story, that was his favorite tea, and another telling of the story, he favored it as a tea for his troops. It was a healing tea for his troops, I guess, who'd been injured in battle. Here's another composite. We don't often recognize these as composites as daisy family plants because the heads are so small. We don't notice that that's not a flower, but it's actually a flowering head, tiny little composite flowering head with no more than 5 or 6 flowers, and the head always surrounded by an involucre of bracts. And this one is distinctive for its plantain-like broad leaves. It really do. It's somewhat larger than plantain leaves, and they sort of stick up in the air. They don't lie flat on the ground as plantain leaves. And we'll actually look at one of the native plantains later in the presentation today. So that's pale prairie Indian plantain, sometimes called plantain-leaved Indian plantain, Plantaginifolia, really referring to the plantains with that name. And this is the pale Indian plantain. This one has the more maple, I find it more of a maple-like leaf, the same very small composite flower heads and a more maple-like leaf. That really looks, well, somewhat like some maples, maybe even more like the, what is it? The London plane tree has a leaf very much like that.
Hey, Tom,
Let's look at
a question in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
Is the prairie Indian plantain easy or difficult to grow?
It comes up pretty well in our prairie restorations. In fact, this one is, if you go up in Wisconsin, I attended a workshop there a couple of years ago, and they think of it as a weed when it gets into their prairie restorations. I've never seen it become weedy in ours. It does occur both in prairies and in savannas along the edges of prairies here. So it's not particularly hard to propagate by seed. I've never tried planting it by, planting plants, but it seems to come up from seed pretty readily in our restorations, both in woods and out in prairies. Thistles are one that, because, we get used to the classic daisy flower with both ray and disc flowers. And when we're looking at the thistle, we don't have any rays. They're all disc flowers and all clustered together into a beautiful pinky purple disc surrounded by this involucre of very sharp spines. Now we'll look at the Circium thistles like Hill's thistle and many of the field thistles, and they'll have each of these pieces of the pappus are like a feather, whereas with Carduus, the nodding thistle, each one of these is a simple trichome or a simple hair that's unbranched. And this is Canada thistle by contrast. So this one is a biennial, and it is a problem in restoration, and we do herbicide it and we do try to get it out, but it's not nearly as much of a problem with this one as a perennial, and it's cloned by root suckers, and this will cover, I have seen it cover acres of ground, just dense masses of these Canada thistles, and it doesn't come from Canada, but we tend to blame things on Canada. In Canada, they don't call it Canada thistle, Circium arvense. It just occurs in open fields, disturbed ground, but is a rather problem invasive in prairie restorations. The heads are smaller, similar color, similar structure, but a much smaller head. The leaves are smaller, not quite as prickly as the leaves of nodding thistle, all joined together underground. Now here is these are modified sepals of the flower. You wouldn't think that if you look at the flower when it's in flower and take a thistle head apart, you can see that these are in the position outside of the petals, and so they have to be the sepals or modified sepals. You can just barely see the veins of the feather here. Here's just to show you the Carduus, the nodding thistle has the simple trichome. All the Circiums, all the other thistles have this branched trichome or feather-like trichome. With the bull thistle, another aggressive introduced thistle in our area, we have the very, very prickly involucre at the base, similar color, a beautiful pinky purple color. The spiny winged nature of the stem is distinctive on this. Once you get some height growth to it, that separates it from the others. The really bulbous, prickly involucre also helps to separate it from some of the other thistles. A problem weed, one that we get rid of when we find it in restorations, but not one that tends to cover acres of ground. Really a problem for farmers who are trying to graze livestock. Bull thistle gets in there, and obviously the cows don't like to eat it. There's a beautiful prairie plant of dry prairies, the pale purple coneflower. And the coneflower you typically see in the gardens is the purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. It has a much wider leaf. The pale purple coneflower of our area has much narrower leaves. They're quite hairy, both the leaf and the stem, this beautiful composite flower head with both ray and disc flowers. We'll talk about the reason for the name cone later on. The cone flowers are just a sort of really informal, separate group of the composite flower heads, and it has to do with the shape of the receptacle. Yeah, the hairy stem and narrow leaves, really differentiating the pale purple coneflower from the purple coneflower. The false sunflower is one that probably, I see it both in prairies and in savannas. Of vegetation in Wisconsin many years ago, Carduus said it reached its maximum occurrence actually in savannas and not in prairies, because our savannas are often really invaded and with invasive shrubbery that casts too much shade. This one is often more common out in the open today, but when you open up a savanna and get sunlight in there, it does quite well in oak woods. One of the distinctive things about this is opposite leaves. Now, some sunflowers have opposite leaves, but this is some of the sunflowers that are opposite often become alternate as you go toward the top. These are always opposite, broad, ovate leaves that are opposite. And if you look closely at the flower head, you'll see that the rays are actually fertile. You see the stigma of the style and stigma of the female part of the flower exerted from the base of the ray flower. Whereas you look at the true sunflowers, Helianthus, those ray flowers are sterile. There is no style and stigma exerted from this. So this, while it looks like it would be an ovary that could turn into a seed, never is sterile, doesn't turn into a seed. Only the ray flowers produce seed in a true sunflower, whereas the false sunflowers, both ray and disc, produce seeds. The yellow coneflower is one of the more common prairie flowers in our restorations, very easy to reproduce by seed. One of the pleasant things about it is when it goes to seed later in the year, just crush one of the flower heads between your fingers and it has the most lovely aroma. I mean, it should be bottled and used in perfumes. And the reason for the name coneflower is really well exhibited here. The cone is the shape of the receptacle. Something like a sunflower has a flat receptacle. In the oxeye daisy, it's a flat receptacle. But in the coneflowers, the receptacle is cone-shaped, and it means the middle of the flower, the disc, stands up above the plane of attachment of the rays. Really strikingly so in the gray coneflower. And you can see again how the flowers start flowering on the edges and they're moving upward gradually toward the top. Now we're into the monocots again. I mentioned that just to begin with. Remember, monocots have flower parts in threes, huge grass-like leaves in the case of the iris, and those leaves all come together into a sort of flattened structure right at the base, making them very easy to tell from something like cattails, even before they start to flower. Now we know that it's a monocot and the flower parts are in threes, but there's a puzzle here. Sepal, it turns out these are on the outside, so those are the sepals. The petals are these three here. So that's as I work from the outside in, it's sepal petal. But the next thing I see are three more things that look like petals again. What's going on? And there's nothing in the middle of the flower. But if you actually look closely, what you find is those three things in the center are actually the style and stigma of the iris flower. It just looks, it's modified into a petaloid shape, and hidden under it is the stamen. It's hidden under the petal-like stigma, and the receptive surface of the stigma is right under that flap right there. It's fascinating how flowers conserve that basic structure of sepal, petal, stamen, pistil, but they modify it into so many bizarre shapes and hide the parts and diminish the parts or exaggerate the parts, and you end up creating all that beautiful diversity of the world of flowers. This is an introduced member of the iris genus, and both of them grow in marshes. And it's a striking and beautiful plant, and you want to love it, but it is an introduced plant. Some of you may be more aware than I have. I've never seen it as a problem invasive in terms of crowding out a lot of natives, but it is an introduced plant, and when we have the chance, we generally remove it. Same basic iris structure, the beautiful large flower of the irises. Obviously, many irises have been brought into cultivation into just big, beautiful flowers that grace many of our gardens around homes and institutions. The legume family, a large family that blooms mostly in the summer and later in the summer. And legume flowers can actually be of three different flower structures, but I'm really going to look, because almost all of ours are what's called the papilionaceous or butterfly-shaped flower. I'll just stick with that. And it has 5 petals. 2 of them are fused together into the keel, like a boat shape. 2 of them are on the sides. We call those the wing. And one large one is on top, and we call that the standard or flag. Both standard means flag. I, for some reason, learned it as flag many years ago, but everywhere I look today, they call it the standard. So we have the keel, the wings, and the standard. So within the genus, or within this papilionaceous legumes, that's a conserved structure. So let's look to see. Oh, and the legume, the family is named for the fruit, the pod fruit of the legume, which gives us many of the things that we eat. But be careful, some legumes are deadly poisonous. But many of the like beans and peas are all legumes. It's a beautiful example of a simple folded carpum. One other interesting character of legumes is the pulvini, and there's little structures at the base and the top of the leaf that's evident in almost all the legumes. I couldn't find a good picture of it online, so I just went in the backyard and pulled off a little sprig of the redbud, the legume tree, and you can see the swollen base and tip of the stalk of the leaf. Supposedly the pulvini is a structure that is used in orientation of the leaf. As the leaf is developing, the pulvini can change its shape and orient the leaf to the sunlight. Here's a native legume with compound leaves. We have almost all of our, I say that, I can't say all, I never like to say all. I think almost all of our legumes have compound leaves. They can be usually pinnately compound, very occasionally palmately compound. Now this one, just to start with, has a sort of bizarre shape to the flower. This is our wing, or not the wing, the standard or flag of the flower coming up here. It's sort of divided on top. This is the keel of the flower, and these are the 2 wings. The ground nut sort of suggests that it's like peanut, but that's not really the case. It has a conventional legume pod with seeds in it. I think the seeds are edible in this case, but the ground nut, the ground word, is really about tubers that are on the roots below ground. I've never tasted these because I rarely see the flower and I don't want to dig them up to get to the tubers. But the tubers are supposedly used by native peoples as a food source, and are quite edible and tasty. Lead plant is another flowering legume. I usually recognize this, and I'll have a picture of this before we leave this species. I usually recognize it at some distance because it's very hairy, and on a sunny day, those hairs reflect the sunlight. It gives the whole plant a silvery sheen to it. The very finely divided leaves, and the silvery sheen is how I typically I've identified the plant by the time we get within 10 feet of it. This is Sophrudicos. That's a nice multisyllabic word. You see a lot of them today. You need to learn these multisyllabic words just to drop them on friends and family at dinner, just to irritate them. Sophrudicos means woody at the base. It means that the bottom of this plant is actually shrub-like, and if it's not burned to the ground, it will stay alive from year to year. But if it is burned to the ground, the lead plant just functions like a herbaceous perennial and grows up and flowers like a normal herbaceous perennial. Plant generally of drier prairies. There you get some sense of the silvery sheen of the plant, typically in drier prairies. Illinois tick trefoil. This is one of my favorite prairie plants for a feature that I'll talk about later. Here you can, it's the typical papilionaceous or butterfly-like legume flower. Leaflets of 3. And you'll see here a fairly long stalk on that central flower. I think I've got another, long stalk on the flower, on the leaf. And the leaves are covered with hook hairs beneath. So if you take one of these leaves off and you're wearing a sort of fuzzy, cotton or wool or something, they just stick to you like Velcro. It's a wonderful trick to play on your friends. And this will differentiate it from a quite similar looking showy tick tree we'll look at here in just a minute. So the stalk, leaflets of 3 long leaflets, and the stalk on this center leaflet, and the hooked hairs beneath. And this is the legume pod. Here is segmented and can break apart between the segments. And we call a segmented legume pod a loment. Botanists love terms. And so that's a loment, another not particularly long term, but a specialized term for the legume pod of the desmodiums. And this is the showy tick tree fall, very similar flowers, but here a very short stalk on the leaflet, and the leaves beneath have hairs, but they're not hooked hairs. As you can see here, a very similar loment to that of the Illinois tick tree fall. They'll both grow in prairies, often not far away from one another. So distinguishing them by the stalk on the leaflet, the lack of hooked hairs, often useful identification characters. And this is another, well, we used to call this a desmodium, and more recently, molecular biology has said this is sufficiently separated in evolution from the desmodiums to put it in a different genus, the Hylodesmum, genus Hylodesmum glutinosum. The pointed tick tree foil, again, leaves of 3. Here the leaves are very broad and ovate with a very long, pronounced, what we would call an acuminate tip to the leaf. Flowers, shorter stalk to the flowers, but similar flowers to the 2 desmodiums we just looked at. And there's the loment here, very much divided pod that breaks apart easily between the segments. This, oops, I guess I got my, this is, didn't get the this is Lathyrus aqualucus, or it's too irritating for me. Oh well. It's Lathyrus aqualucus, our marsh vetchling, and this is a very rare plant of our area. It has compound leaves, nice distinctive what we call the stipule at the base of the leaf. You see the stems of the leaf are winged along the edges. That's a distinctive character to the marsh vetchling. This is a rare plant of oak savannas. We've only got a few occurrences in Glacial Park and in the county. It does have a bit of a tendril. It's a viney plant with a tendril at the end of the leaflet. And there is another, actually, group of plants, but called the vetches, that are very similar. The flowers look very similar. The stem isn't winged, and if you look at the style of the flower, the vetch has a big tuft of hair at the end of the style, and with Lathyrus, the marsh vetchling, is just a little bit of hair only along one edge of the style. So the vetches, in my experience, are always out in open areas. There are a few introduced ones. Vicia americana is a native, relatively common vetch of open areas, often slightly disturbed areas, where the marsh vetchling is a plant of oak savannas and a very rare plant. For a couple of common invasives to our area, the white and yellow sweet clovers. These come from our agricultural history, brought in its very early growth, good for livestock feed. It grows in very poor soils, it can be used and is used even today for stabilizing steep slopes in where you've done a lot of earthwork. It is a nitrogen fixer, so it grows in very poor soils. This will grow 5, 6, 7 feet tall. Note, as opposed to some of the other clover-like plants, it has a stalk central leaflet, and the irregular teeth along the edge of the leaf here. The stalk of white flowers at the end of the leaf. The yellow is quite similar, somewhat shorter stature, probably a foot or two shorter in general. Obviously, it's very site specific. And it blooms a bit earlier. And obviously, by the time it's in bloom, the flowers are yellow instead of white. But in its vegetative form as it's growing, they're really difficult to tell apart. Once they come into flower, they're fairly easy. The white seems to be the much more common species in McHenry County. The trifolium clovers are distinctive and the leaflets are all sessile. This is the red clover. This one was used as for hay and for livestock feed in farming times. The red clover has a hairy stalk. We'll look at the white clover that's more common in your yard at home and in areas that are mowed. And the distinctive things about the trifolium genus is that the leaflets are all sessile. The flowers in red clover, the flowers are sessile, meaning there's no stalk on the individual flowers. They're attached directly to the receptacle, and the stems are hairy. When we look at the white clover, the stems are on little stalks, and the stems are glabrous. Sometimes the white clover, you can see it here, has a pinkish color to the blooms, and so it's not immediately obvious at first glance from the color which you're looking at. The white clover is usually, particularly where you mow it, much shorter and much smaller statured, but they can overlap in that. So remembering the stalked flowers and glabrous stems will help you to differentiate those two, red clover from white clover. This white chevron seems to be somewhat narrower in the white clovers, but I can't see any keys that use that as an identification character, so it's obviously very variable. Let's look at a few things in the lily family, where now the lily family is a monocot again, so we expect flower parts in threes. This is actually 3 sepals and 3 petals, so then when they look alike, we call them tepals. The leaves are all parallel veined, sort of grass-like, but if you, in your hands, they feel thick and fleshy. When you look at the flower heads, these aren't flower buds. Onions do at least many onions do an odd thing. They create what's called bulbils. And these are actually means of vegetative reproduction. These are genetically identical to the parent plant. They can fall off and start growing and create a clone of the parent without which forego sexual reproduction. Actually, if you look through flowering plants, you find lots of examples of plants cloning themselves underground, in this case, above ground, of self-pollinating, of avoiding sexual reproduction in order to at least create some offspring, even in years when they're not pollinated. There's the wild onions that you could harvest. I've never tasted these. The whole plant has an oniony flavor. I assume we could use it. It'd probably be a fairly hot onion. In my backyard, and in probably many of your yards and in mowed areas, you'll find the crow garlic, or sometimes again called wild onion or wild garlic, Allium venale, which is introduced and has a very circular hollow leaf. Can be very common in mowed grass, or sometimes just occasional, and that's quite different in its leaf, although in flower it looks very similar, quite different in its leaf from the native wild onion. It's just a cross section of the wild onion leaf. Here we have a slightly more conservative plant of more remnant oak woodlands, not as highly disturbed as sometimes you'll find the wild onion, Allium canadensis. Allium tricoccum is generally and a little bit higher quality woods, not as disturbed. Notable for its broad parallel veined leaves. Again, the individual flowers look much like the wild onion, 3 sepals, 3 petals, or together 6 tepals. This one doesn't seem to produce bulbils like the wild onion. The leeks are a bit more, well, leek-like in shape. If you buy leeks in the grocery store, they're not as bulb-like in shape. There's the 3-petal, 3-sepal flower. And we have another variety of Allium tricoccum that's actually quite common in McHenry County and in many parts of the Chicago area, called variation Burdickii, with narrower leaves. So next time you see wild leeks, take a look to see which one you're looking at. If you take just a little part of that leaf and crush it, you'll smell that distinctive onion odor. Intermission. So let's take 5 minutes right now, and you can stretch your legs, get a drink of water, and we'll reconvene at high noon, or excuse me, 11 o'clock in 5 minutes. Okay.
By high noon, we won't be here anymore.
No, that's true. I misread my watch.
All good.
Or anyone who wants to ask questions now, that's fine.
Can either unmute or put them in the chat. I think we had a couple of comments of one of my favorite plants, I think, was at the marsh fetchling.
Yeah.
And we find it in Cook County regularly. When I say that was for the Japanese hedge parsley.
Yeah, that's one that's slowly becoming a more and more of a problem in McHenry County. It's the problem is we don't tend to recognize things as problems until they're too big to solve. You could quote me on that.
Are any of the allium or lily plants poisonous?
Not that I know of. I think that genus, I mean, some of them are probably tastier than others.
Good rule of thumb not to eat anything unless you are 100% sure.
Yeah,
you know exactly what it is.
That is my rule, and I've always followed that. Long ago, when I first, my first attraction to wildflowers, and this would have been in summer of 1981 when I bought my first, and it was an edible plants book. That was my attraction to wildflowers. I went into the local wheat field and was wandering around and finding lamb's quarter and things that I could eat and tasting them. But I never with wild carrots, I was always a little afraid of those to start with because it told me that there are lookalikes that can be poisonous. I mean, I can tell them apart pretty easily now, so I don't worry about it. But I don't really find wild carrots when I've tasted them. They don't taste all that good, so I'm not tempted to go around and graze on poison hemlock roots either. It would be interesting to pull up a poison, put some gloves on and pull up a poison hemlock once and see if the root smells like carrot. That would be a real kicker if it did.
And a follow-up comment, I avoid mushrooms or toadstools for the same reason.
Yeah, I feel like I can recognize a morel, but that's about it. Puffballs, I think I've tasted those. But generally, even then, when I've got someone with me that at least claimed to know more than I did. So, of course, we both could have been dead at that point. I like things that I can taste, like tasting a hawthorn fruit or tasting a crabapple fruit. I like to do it every now and then just to remind myself, because I like the sensory experience. I like touching things, smelling things, and tasting things when it's safe.
They actually make a Mexican candy called tejocote that is out of the hawthorn fruit.
Do you buy the hawthorns?
I think you can just get it at the store.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Maybe they domesticated some and get bigger
Probably a
fruits. I
different
mean, I like
variety.
a little crab apple. I mean, I've tasted them. They weren't bad. They weren't anything I was going to fill up on. But I can remember this is a tree story. This trees were my first love many years ago. But years and years and years after someone showed me a sweet birch, Betula lenta, and the very distinctive sweet tangy odor of it. Years and years later, I ran into it and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I smelled it and I instantly knew what it was. It was the smell that evoked the memory. So sometimes those things like taste and smells lodged in deeper down in the brain. And we'll come back to you later when a lot of the sort of intellectual length of trichomes and number of petals stuff leaves you.
Time for one more question if anybody wants to throw one in there. All right, not seeing anything in the chat
Okay.
just yet. So I think we're good to continue.
We'll get going again. Okay, we're going to look at milkweeds now. And this is just a fascinating group. I mean, I've known these since childhood. It's one of those things you sort of learn by the fact that it's got milky stuff in it. Yeah, I knew these before I knew any one of those few things you learned is just sort of general in the world sort of things before you ever take any interest in flowers. But the closer you look at a milkweed, the more interesting it gets. And this is a common milkweed. I mean, it's until the monarchs began dwindling in numbers and we all became milkweed crazy. This was considered a weed, and we were trying to get rid of it. And now suddenly it's a valuable plant, and we're trying to plant it again. And you're all probably familiar with the fact that monarch butterfly that lays its eggs on members of the milkweed genus Asclepias. The larvae feed on the milkweed, and it has to feed on the milkweed. And so if there are no milkweeds, there are no monarchs. And so that's the reason why we're worried about milkweed populations today. Now, this is a crazy shaped flower here. This looks like it's on the outside. These look like these ought to be sepals in these petals, but wait a second. No, the sepals are actually tucked up under here, and these are the petals. And so then what is that? So let's look a little more closely here. So the sepal is down here, and I'll have a better picture to see the sepal with later. The petals are outside of that. That's deflects downward. And then this is called the hood. Well, what's a hood? It's not a sepal petal stamen or pistil. Well, the hood apparently is an outgrowth of the base of the petal, or it's an outgrowth of the base of the stamen. And depending on which source I look at, it could be either, and for all I know, it's both. But in any way, it is a separate part that is an outgrowth of probably the petal. And inside of that, so this tissue here is really the style of the stamen, because their anthers are up here and the anthers are fused together, and they're fused to the stigma, the pollen receptive part of the pistil, and they're all fused together into what's called the gynostegium. Really complex flower structure. And when an insect visits this and it's walking around, it sticks its foot. This sounds like you're just using an accident to pollinate, but the insect foot falls through the stigmatic slit, and it picks up And at the top of the stigmatic slit, all the pollen grains are in these two little sacs called pollinia, and the whole thing together is called a pollinarium. And this is positioned right at the top of the stigmatic slit, and when the insect pulls its foot out, it drags this whole pollinarium out with it. And takes it on to the next flower, and then when it sticks its foot through, again, it drags the pollinarium in there, and that fertilizes the receptive surface of the stigma, which is on the inside. The horns are another bizarre feature, and we just assume that has something to do with directing pollinators. But in any event, fascinating flower structure and the story of pollination. While monarchs exclusively use this for their larvae and will pollinate it, many other things pollinate the flower. Only the monarch larvae are feeding on the plant. And it matures into this big, I call them hairs. They're maybe too coarse to be hairs, but this big hairy green pod in the light pink flower to differentiate it from the swamp milkweed, which is a native plant, more conservative native plant of generally higher quality areas, not a weed, growing a deeper pink flower in a smooth pod. So the fact that it's growing in the wetland, it's a deeper pink, the leaves are narrower than the common milkweed, and the pods are smooth, pretty easy to distinguish from the common milkweed. Butterfly weed is kind of everyone's favorite because we have so few, particularly native plants. I mean, daylilies are non-native. It has that same bright orange color. But these are iridescent orange. They must have given people the idea for the safety orange color because these glow in a dry prairie hillside. Same, even though there are things that are different from other milkweeds, it has a hairy stem, different from the common or the swamp milkweed. It has alternate leaves, which are different from every other milkweed. It has smooth, narrow pods, and it has no milky sap. So even though the monarch larvae will use this, it doesn't have the milky sap, which is the toxin they need. So I don't know how that works. Whether the monarch larvae that use this don't get that toxin within them. The whole point is that you get the toxin within the larvae, and then birds and other predators leave the larvae alone because they don't want to get poisoned. But in any event, the butterfly weed doesn't have the milky sap, the latex on the inside. This one is one that once you get to know wildflowers, you'll get to know this one. It's one that'll announce itself from 50 feet away. There's the long, narrow, smooth pods. And this is a milkweed again that can occur in native, higher quality dry prairies, but you often find it in dry, disturbed areas, in dry pastures. It's the world milkweed, verticillata, and verticillate means world. So the leaves are very narrow and whorled in arrangement, so more than 2 leaves at a node and a smooth, narrow pod. That in its occurrence in these generally drier places, fairly distinctive plant. This one has the milky sap again, like other milkweeds. If you pull one of those little leaves off, and you can see the monarch larvae here feeding on the world milkweed. The mint family. This is a family that flowers mostly in mid and late summer. Square stem, opposite leaves. I'll try to put even more notes on these when I do the PDF. You can look at it later. Square stem and opposite leaves is just one of those things that anyone who knows mints knows that you're always looking for that. That doesn't mean that there aren't members of other families that sometimes can have square stems and opposite leaves, but mints always have that. And in this case, with the wound border, Stachys pilosa, again, this one you're going to find in natural areas in wet mesic prairies, moist meadows. The stems are hairy all the way around, the flats and the angles. When we look at the other Stachys that also grows, we'll look at another Stachys here in just a minute. Let's look just at the mint flower. The mint flower is bilaterally symmetric. We can pass a plane through the flower vertically, and it's the same on both sides. It has two lips, one upper, one lower lip. The lower lip has three parts. You can see them as a lobe to either side here, and then one lobe below. The upper lip has two parts, sometimes obvious, sometimes not. So it's a two-lipped flower. In fact, the conserved name of the family was Labiatae, labium or lip. Now it's called Lamiaceae. But that refers to the lip nature of the flower, one lower, one upper lip. And this is the other Stachys. Hispida grows in similar places, similar looking flower head, but if you look closely, you can see that the flats here are smooth and only the angles have hairs. The leaves are also similar between the two. So two sister species grow in very similar places and yet are different by virtue of that hairs on the stem. My eyes got bad enough long ago that looking at things up close, I like to have a hand lens with me. I tend to put it on in the morning when I get up and take it off when I go to bed at night now. Yeah, hand lens can be useful for seeing some of these very small characters. This is a neat mint because this one breaks the rule of mints. It doesn't have two lips, it only has one. The upper lip has disappeared. You find that in plant evolution. Sometimes a part will just disappear. If it's there, it's always in the same place in terms of sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. You never find a plant where the stamen or the sepals on the inside and the petals on the outside. No, always on the outside, sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. Here, one of the lips is gone, and this lower lip has two exaggerated side lobes here that sort of move upward, almost like mimicking an upper lip. But these are actually outgrowths of the lower lip of the flower. When this one is in, well, you see the vegetative parts look very much like Stachys. But once it's in flower, it's easy to tell from the Stachys because it lacks the upper lip of the flower. So very easy identification character for the Teucriums, the germander. Purple giant hyssop by the time it's in flower, it is such a huge, I mean, when you're in the woodlands, most plants are not this tall, few of them, but most of them, I mean, this one often just towers above the plants around it. It is 5-6 feet tall sometimes. The broad name leaves like a figwort, the scrophulariifolium. We'll see scrophularia a little bit later today, those big, broad, ovate leaves, toothed, and that big spike of bluish purple flowers make this one a hard one not to be able to show showy blue flowers. When you're in the woods, it's going to stand out, not like a sore thumb, but like a thumb that you can't ignore, but it's not sore. Okay. Anyway, you all know this one, bee balm, summer flowering, mint, square stem, opposite leaves with that crush the leaf, beautiful Monarda odor, the source of the bee balm or a Monarda in Earl Grey tea. You could just take the leaves of this and boil them in water and get a nice Earl Grey tea flavor. Square stem, and then that distinctive head when the bee balm is finished flowering. The nettle family. This is an interesting family because here we have the flowering plant re-evolving wind pollination. I say re-evolving because this is evolving from non-flowering plants before that used wind pollination. And the whole structure of the flower is built around the idea of insect pollination, of putting sepal, petal, and stamen together. And when we look closely at this is the tall nettle. I mean, we sometimes call it stinging nettle in our area. Its more proper common name is tall nettle. It's dioecious, and so it's both male and female. Again, now that you know that, when you see tall nettle, go up closely and look closely to see whether you're looking at a male or female flower. And Its close sister species, the actual stinging nettle, which I believe is European, and is introduced in this country, and you will find that in some disturbed areas. But that has a broader leaf, otherwise quite similar, and a very similar looking spikes of flowers in the axils of leaves. This, if you want the real experience of stinging nettle, this is more stingy than even stinging nettle. This is wood nettle, and this one will grow not out in open marshy areas or old degraded fens where you find the slender nettle. This one is in the woods, in shady areas, shady, moist areas. It will often form very dense patches. And if you will walk through this, even with brand new blue jeans on, the stinging hairs are long enough that they'll punch through the blue jeans, and you'll notice your legs start to feel sort of tingly to start with, and then the tingling sensation will turn to a burning sensation, and it's very unpleasant. I had that happen to me years ago, so I tend to avoid it if at all possible. Long stinging hairs, very prickly, unusual for anything in the nettle family because the leaves are alternate. In fact, the leaves remind me of sort of a basswood or a mulberry leaf, or an unlobed mulberry leaf. And this one is monoecious, both male and female flowers on the same plant, different genus Laportia. Another genus in the nettle family, Bulgaria, and this one is smooth and has no stinging hairs. Otherwise, at first glance, it looks very much like the introduced stinging nettle, broad ovate leaves, spikes of flowers. It's dioecious like the stinging nettle, only no stinging hairs. This one is generally in sort of moist woodland locations, so not out in the open where you would find either the stinging nettle or the tall nettle, but in the woods, maybe in similar places where you might find the wood nettle. And this one is a much smaller statured plant. The others can grow several feet tall. This one is a small statured plant, generally a foot or foot and a half tall in moist, shady places. And it's clearweed. Clearweed really refers to the almost translucent stem. And you really feel like you can see into the stem when you look at this plant, and it's all pumped up by the turgor pressure, the water pressure in the plant. It seems to have very little sort of structure, sort of woody structure to it, or cellulose-like structure to it. You get a feeling that if it lost turgor pressure, it would just flop over. Otherwise, nettle leaves opposite, and the spikes of wind-pollinated flowers. This one, I guess, can be either monoecious or dioecious, that is, either being male and female, or just male or female. And again, no stinging hairs like the Bulgaria. Our evening primrose family has two very common plants in it, and I'll look at both of these. One of them is Enchanter's Nightshade. That is almost, if you start looking around in shady woodland areas, this is a native plant, but one that persists even in very degraded woods that are very deeply shaded with an understory of buckthorn and honeysuckle. You'll find a few Enchanter's Nightshades. It will occur as an occasional plant, even in higher quality savannas, if you look for it. Formaris, and there's a botanical term, but formaris means flower parts in fours. I could say 5 maris if I was talking about a sunflower. This is just how botanists tend to talk, and I'll just throw that in here just for your information. 4 maris means flower parts are in 4. 3 maris, the monocots are 3 maris flowers. This is a 4 maris flower. The sunflower is a 5 maris flower. Just shorthand ways of talking. Here you can see the four sepals and 4 petals, 4-lobed capsule, little hooked hairs on it. So if you walk through later in the summer, you'll find, and you have low shoes on and fuzzy socks, you'll find these clinging to your socks. They're not really tenacious burrs, but they'll cling enough that you'll carry the seeds around and disperse them for the plant. Here's another plant that's sort of outside of the woods in open disturbed grounds. And again, Formaris, big, beautiful yellow flower. The day flowers have several other members of this genus, Echinacea, in our area, but this is the really common one. And notice the cross-shaped stigma in the center of the flower, very distinctive for the genus Echinacea, big 4 petals. And the other thing you'll notice, this is how you'll notice that you missed it the year before, is you'll find these woody stalks. I was pointing this out to some colleagues just about a week ago when we were out herbiciding in a weedy area near a road. This is the evening primrose, or common evening primrose flower. In the what's left of it in the winter, the capsule breaks its 4 parts. It breaks apart in 4 parts and has a very distinctive woody, and it lasts well into the next summer. So easy to see. If you see that, then you can look around. You can probably find the evening primrose growing nearby. And it is a biennial, hence the name Echinacea biennis. The plantain family, a humble plant family, which has gained a few more regal relatives recently. With molecular biology, botanists are reevaluating genera and families, and there have been a lot of shifts in plant names over the last 10 years as we learn more about their evolutionary relationships. And in the Plantago, remember the prairie lead Indian plantain, or what's called Plantaginifolia. That's referring to this genus Plantago. And you see that these leaves look very much like the prairie lead Indian plantain, only here with reddish stalks. Now this is almost identical to Plantago major that's probably growing in your yard outside. In fact, you may have Plantago regalia, the red stalk plantain. You might have Plantago major, the common plantain. You might have both of them growing in your yard. Look for the reddish leaf stalks to differentiate the two. Oddly, this is another wind-pollinated plant, and you can see here the stigma of the wind-pollinated plant sticking out and trying to gather pollen grains blowing nearby. Here are the long stamens. You can see them exerted from the flowers over here, dangling in the breeze, long filaments with the anthers dangling in the breeze is often a signal that you're looking at a wind-pollinated plant. Again, plants re-evolved wind pollination, presumably sometime in the evolution of this flower when it was starved of pollinating insects, and so the few individuals that could pollinate by the wind survived, and you evolved a new species, or in this case, a new genus, Plantago. But we have a few now. This used to be in the Scrophulary ACE, the snapdragon family, but we've put it now in the plantain family, this beautiful prairie plant, Culver's root, Veronicastrum virginicum, and you can see here the flowers in 5s. Whorled at nodes, very unusual in our prairie flora, so just by that long before it flowers, you can recognize this. And then these 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 spikes of beautiful white flowers sticking up, each one sort of pyramidal in shape. It's just a beautiful flower that sort of announces its name from some distance. Again, in the humble plantain family. And another plant now in the humble plantain family that's quite showy is a foxglove beard tongue. Again, formerly put in the snapdragon family, the Scrophulary ace, but now reassigned to the plantain family. Big showy white flowers, bilateral, obviously bilaterally symmetric around the center line here, 3 lower lobes, 2 upper lobes. And then a rosette of leaves that often confuses me, but we're doing plant surveys. When I see these, I don't know what they are. They just look like a rosette of sort of homogeneous leaves. But as it starts to grow up, you get longer leaves, and then you get this very distinctive stem with these long lanceolate, that long ovate would be broader, lanceolate is longer and narrower. Long lanceolate leaves and sessile on the leaf stalks and somewhat shiny in their surface. So that vegetative part of the plant is very distinctive. That and those spikes of big showy white bilaterally symmetric flowers. We've got them growing in our little garden outside the house here in Libertyville now. It's a beautiful prairie plant. Always a nice one to get established in a prairie restoration. It's a crowd pleaser. And the rose family. This is a neat family today. We're going to look at, because we're going to look at some really conserved structures within the family. This is tall agrimony, and this is a common plant of our woodlands, oak woodlands. You can see here it has 5 sepals, 5 petals, a brush of stamens. I'm not sure, it looks like about 10 stamens. It has, so this is the fruit, okay? And you can see this structure here under this flower. And so there are little green sepals here. Outside of the sepals are these hooks. This will be the means of dispersal later. So these must be an outgrowth of the sepals. If it's outside of the sepals, there isn't any regular flower part outside of that. So these have to be an outgrowth of the sepals. The sepals and petals fall off, and these become the bur that allows the capsule containing the seeds to be dispersed. So that's tall agrimony. And then, oh, here we can see this is the structure. Ovary is below, sepal, petal, stamen become free from the ovary. Only above the sepals fall off, and you're left with a brush of hooks down below the sepals that is the means of dispersal. This is the distinctive leaf of all the members of the agrimony genus, and the alternate small and large leaflets. At least I would call these leaflets. Large leaflets, smallish, large, smallish. That alternating back and forth, regular alternating back and forth, is a distinctive feature of the genus Agrimonia. The difference between the way I recognize this one, a common member of oak savannas, is under the leaf, its hirsute, or sort of long hairs, only along the veins beneath, scattered hairs along the veins beneath, whereas soft agrimony, which can occur in very similar places in Glacial Park, this is more common around the visitor center in the woods, and as I go southward in the woodlands, it switches, and Agrimonia gripposepala, the tall agrimony, becomes the more common one. And the easiest way to tell them apart is just to touch the leaf and feel if it's velvety beneath, it's the soft agrimony. If it has only scattered hairs along the veins, it's the tall agrimonia. Flowers are similar. Again, the fruits have the hooked hairs below the sepals. Here are the sepal, and we can see it a little bit better here. We have sepal, petal, stamen, and the hooked hairs arranged around the outside of the sepals, so they must be an outgrowth of the sepal tissue that is a part of the hypanthium. All that tissue is fused around the ovary. And there's the seeds all, or the capsules all ready to be dispersed.
Hey, Tom, we had a question in the chat.
Okay.
Well, 2 questions actually. How do you make Earl Grey tea from bergamot? Do you use the leaves?
Yes, I use the leaves. You can use them when they're dry, but I'm not patient enough when I'm camping. The leaves are there. You can, like goldenrods, you can make tea from goldenrod leaves. I think the oils are still present in the dried leaves, but the green leaves, to me, like perfectly good tea. Just make sure they're clean and boil them in water, and it, like magic, turns into tea.
Are buttercups in the rose family?
No, buttercups are a buttercup family plant. Yeah, it's a little hard off the. Yeah, I'd have to. Well, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a plant family workshop this winter, and we'll look more in depth at the families and how to tell the families apart at that time. So I'll sort of punt that bit of that question in the winter.
All right, prompted a few questions. We planted a lot of milkweed and recovered farmland near a junction of Deer Path and River Road. Does anyone know if it was successful? There are 3 types of milkweed there.
Well,
I'm guessing you're talking about the Alden Gap milkweed planting. I don't know if we've necessarily been back to that exact part, but usually plugs
Yeah.
are pretty successful.
yeah, we'd have to go back. Well, that's a good question when we go back. Are we doing a planting there again this fall? So we can go back this fall and see how well we did with the milkweeds.
And last question before we move on. Did you say the orange daylily is not native?
It is non-native, and as far as I know, I think it doesn't reproduce from seed, but it reproduces just by wherever you plant it. It tends to spread underground. That's the story I got from them. I'm not a gardener, but I don't think it reproduces from seed. It does tend to be long persistent wherever it's planted. Anyway.
All right, we're good to move on.
Okay, well, we're going to look at several plants here that will all look quite a bit alike in their basic flower. Now, here is the white avens, a super common plant of disturbed woods. I even got it in my backyard here where it was overrun by buckthorn before we moved in. Any place that's shady in the Chicago area will accumulate some white avens. It's a native plant. It has 5 sepals, 5 petals, many stamens, and then a pistil made up of many separate little pistils or separate carpels. It's the basic structure. We're going to see that in a number of different rose family plants here. And then we're going to see how they turn into some radically different looking fruits. And here is the white avens. And I always find this kind of neat that these lowest leaves you see in the springtime are evergreen. They're lying under the snow. They're deep blue-green in color with white veins. And then it sends up a shoot of more conventional green leaves that very different color, more serrate along the edges of this very different looking leaves, and then creates its flowers during the summer. There's a look at that. This is not quite mature yet, but you can see the separate little achenes or nut-like fruits. Each of those little carpels matures into a separate nut, and the style of the carpel of the little ovary then becomes the beak, and there's a little hook on the end, and so this eventually breaks apart and attaches to your socks as you walked by in the woods. And there is just a graphic. This is a basic pattern we're going to look at: simple petal, many stamens, and a pistil made up of many separate pistils or carpels. Similar story with rough avens. The flower may be even a little less spectacular in terms of its petal size, but same, many stamens, many separate carpels. This one grows in lower areas, a more conservative plant I see in borders of wetlands and in wetlands and low ground, but more out in the open and full sunlight. And there is the fruit again, looking very much like the fruit of white avens. And this one is the sort of the queen of the geums. This is the one everyone wants in their garden. The other 2 are sort of poor sisters. But look again, it's really built exactly the same way. What people plant this for is not their flowers so much as when they're in seed. And if you look closely, you'll see that what becomes the beak and the hook on the humble little white avens becomes the long plumose style of the smoke, of the prairie smoke that allows the seed, that blows in the wind and eventually allows the seed to detach and blow and disperse. So the very same structure, the very same flower structure, in this case, the style of the ovary differentiates into 2 radically different structures to each case to facilitate movement of the seed. This one's a not common, but a plant. I was just seeing it the other day at Lake in the Hills, fen in the dry prairies there, dry gravel hole prairies there. Now we're going to move to a different genus in rose family. But again, 5 sepals, 5 petals, many stamens, and many little carpels in the ovary. So at first glance, it's a pretty similar flower. In this case, the flower matures. Now this looks like a capsule. It's not. These are just the sepals of the flower that dry and sort of fold up around the tiny little. I think I've got a picture later on of the nutlets that are inside of this in one of the cinquefoils. But here we've got hairy stem and pinnately compound leaves. This one is growing out in dry prairies. Most of our other cinquefoils are growing in woods or old meadows or disturbed areas. So when you're out in a high quality prairie, look for this one, pinnately compound, fuzzy leaves, and they need just these distinctive white flowers. The rough cinquefoil, Potentilla norvegica, is in sort of open fields and disturbed ground, generally in high sunlight situations. Here with just 3 leaflets, a flower again that follows the same pattern: 5 sepal, 5 petals, many stamens, and a pistil made up of many separate pistils, or we could call it many separate carpels. This one it's an upright plant, and this one you'll recognize by the 3 leaflets. And there again is that the dried sepals enclosing. I guess, and I'll show you with this one. I'll eventually show you the little nutlets. Potentilla recta, very similar habitat to Potentilla norvegica, open fields, disturbed ground. Yeah, both of them have sort of showy, pretty flowers. Here now, the leaves are palmately compound, 5 to 7, even 9 leaflets lower on the plant. The farther up your plant you go, the fewer leaflets. I know you're saying, well, these petals look bifid, like little notches in them, but that's never used in any of the keys. And in fact, if you keep looking, you'll find that those little notched petals appear in some of the other Potentillas, if not every time, sometimes. So that's not a particularly good identification character. There, you'll see the achenes, many separate. Remember, it's a pistil of many separate carpels. Those occur into all these little nutlets that eventually are dispersed from the sort of I call it a false capsule of the sepals of the flower. And we have one more cinquefoil. It's a fairly big genus, and this is probably the most common one I find working in natural areas. This is Potentilla simplex, and I find it most commonly in the woods. It's a sprawling vine, doesn't climb, it just sprawls around on the forest floor. 5 palmately compound leaflets, again, similar flower structure: 5 sepal, 5 petal, many stamens, and many separate pistils in the center. So palmately compound, like I'm getting like recta, but in the woods, and it's sort of fatter leaflets here. Probably easy to tell them apart. So what we're going to do now is look at this basic structure. We're going to look at exactly how many different fruits can you get from this? Well, you can get a strawberry. Oh no, you're saying, yep, because the receptacle, the big soft part of the strawberry, is the receptacle of the strawberry flower, and each of those tiny little achenes is a matured pistil or carpel. Same structure, very different fruit from what we've been looking at. The blackberry, same story. The receptacle is just a soft part in the center. The pistils of the flower, each one of them creates one of these little bulbs there, a separate separate little drupe or berry-like fruit that's attached to the receptacle. The raspberry, again, same story. Oh, the receptacle in this case stays woody, and it stays on the plant when you pluck the raspberry off. So exactly the same flower structure to start with creates yet another fruit structure. And there's our white avens And there's our prairie smoke. All of those come from basically the same pattern of flower in the rose family. As things like that give me goosebumps. I'm just a kid. And there's cinquefoil, and all the little nuts of cinquefoil inside of that cup of the sepals. Oh, and there's the false. I think this is Indian or barren ground strawberry. Duchesnea, I believe, is the genus on this one. I think it may have been actually put into the genus Potentilla more recently. But again, the swollen receptacle and each of the little nutlets there present on the surface of the receptacle. So one structure, many fruits. Now the snapdragon family used to be a big family. Now most of its members have been moved to other families. This is, I have lots and lots of favorites. This is one of my favorites now because we planted it in the backyard, and these tiny, tiny little flowers. And I mean, they're probably a quarter of an inch from one end to the other. I mean, they are tiny. And you'd think, well, maybe a few little gnats would use them. And instead, even though I can't smell them, I don't have a particularly good sense of smell, but boy, the insects smell them. It's just marvelous to stand there in summer and watch the many different, some tiny, tiny little pollinators and even bumblebees stopping to visit these flowers. If you like pollinators, even though these aren't big showy flowers, you should plant a few figworts because they will really draw just a tremendous diversity of pollinating insects. It's a tall, robust plant. I mean, the ones in my backyard are growing over my head sometimes. They're not always that tall, sometimes only 3 or 4 feet tall. And then they mature into these dry, woody capsules. You see the bilaterally symmetric flower here, which is one of the reasons they used to put it in the Scrophulariaceae. It is now in the, oh no, it is in the Scrophulariaceae. I'm getting confused because it's in the genus Scrophularia. There is one sister species that I don't tend to see nearly as often. It flowers a bit earlier. The flowers are a bit lighter in color, and it has narrower leaves. Scrophularia lanceolata that flowers just a little bit earlier, so you keep your eye out for that one. Similar looking capsules. Another plant that's,
I have a question.
Okay.
Are wild strawberries edible?
Oh yeah, they're delicious. They taste just like domestic strawberries. To my opinion, if you get them at their peak, they're even tastier. I always thought they had the same flavor concentrated in a much smaller berry. And that's different from the Indian strawberry or barren ground strawberry. Or there are a number of other plants that are similar, but if you get the actual wild strawberry, Vulgare virginiana, it's quite tasty. I think we had that one in our spring workshop, I think, last year. This is one of the more distinctive weeds, and it's in the snapdragon family. The flowers are only very weakly bilaterally symmetric. You can see the lower lobes are just a little bit bigger than the lateral and upper lobes. But the thing that, I mean, this big woody spike of that lasts for a long time after the flowers have finished, this big woody spike sticking up there. Big showy yellow flowers when it's in bloom, but for me, it's this rosette of very soft velvety leaves that farmers in central Illinois call the toilet paper plant for obvious reasons. Grows in farm country along the farm field edges. And I suppose if you're out on that tractor all day, you need to avail yourself of whatever you can find. We'll leave it there. But you owe it to yourself. I'm a touchy-feely guy to just feel the velvety. It is one of the most soft, velvety feeling leaves in the plant kingdom. You owe it to yourself to at least touch it. Oh, and here is a really neat family of plants. It has both some lovely things. What would Italian cooking be without tomatoes today, which are actually New World fruit? Italy owes a debt to the New World there. Potatoes are also in that family, New World fruit. Ireland owes a lot to the New World for its potatoes. But let's talk about the family. This is a member that's coming into flower right now. It's bittersweet nightshade. This one is bright red berries are poisonous, and there are both deadly poisonous plants and edible plants in this family. So this is one where you really need to know what you're looking at before you start tasting things. Very beautiful flowers. Here the anthers of the stamens are fused together into a tube, and the style, the female part, goes right through the middle and pokes out the top. There's your sepals are not visible here. You can see the remnants of the sepals here at the base of the fruit. These are the petals that are fused at the base. And the leaves, this is probably the easiest way. This is a woody vine. It crawls around in wet areas. It's introduced. It is a weed in our wetlands. And those leaves are very distinctive even before it flowers. So something to get out of your wetlands if you find it there. This is a close-up of the petals fused right at the base. Not sure what these spots are there. On the petals, it must be a signal to pollinators of some kind or another. Oh, and there's a very similar flower of tomato. The edible tomato, it's in the same genus Solanum. There are both edible plants and poisonous plants in the same genus. But you can see the fused anthers in the tomato flower looking virtually exactly the same, other than for those spots in the different color of the petals. Here's the black nightshade, very similar looking flowers. Again, the anthers fused together. Like bittersweet nightshade, the berry is poisonous. This time it's black in color. You see the remnant sepals on the base of the flower. It will be under these petals. The leaves here lack those basal lobes, but they look very much like tomato leaves. I don't have any in a picture. If you've ever grown tomatoes, they have a sort of irregular, wavy boundary to them. That and the white tomato-like flowers. Good way to distinguish black nightshade. This is a common weed of disturbed ground that is native, I am told, even though it acts like an exotic invasive and is pretty exclusively a plant of disturbed ground. There are a lot of native weeds that we sometimes think the world before Europeans came here was one sort of Edenic garden from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but there was obviously disturbed ground, both in association with human activities for 12,000 years and large mammal activities before that, where they would create places for these aggressive annual weeds to grow and reproduce. Here's another solanum. This time the anthers are not fused. This is the horse nettle, and this one is prickly, hence the name nettle, not at all related to the nettle family. So the anthers are free this time. They're not fused together. That makes it distinctive. You can see the petals are fused for more of their length here, fused for or greater their length. They're very much reflexed. So they're sort of flat outward from the point of attachment. And it creates a fruit for all the world. Looks like a little yellow tomato. But this one is poisonous. I have a friend who tasted this and got sick afterward. And so it's not one to taste. In general, when you're grazing in the tomato family, you better know what you're dealing with, because there are both poisonous, even deadly poisonous plants, depending how much you eat, and perfectly edible plants. And this is one to avoid. The vervain family, which is it just has a couple of members I'm going to do in our area. This is the tall vervain. This one's kind of related to the mint family, and you will see some square stems on some of the vervains. Here, again, a sort of weakly bilaterally symmetric flower, the lower lobe just a little bit larger than the upper lobe. It's a soft, fuzzy plant. It's dry, disturbed ground, and you can find this as a native plant in the drier prairies also. Quite different habitat from the blue vervain, which is a plant of wetlands. This is one, people often talk about seed dormancy. Blue vervain seeds can get buried in wetland sediments, deeply buried, and when unearthed decades later will germinate and grow. So it's a case of extreme seed dormancy. The flowers themselves are very similar. You kind of see the flowering is progressing from the base upward, going up the stem. The leaves are much narrower and more sharply serrate, and the stems are glabrous on the blue vervain, but simply by the habitat, the verbena, hoary vervain and blue vervain, just growing in two very different places, but both native and both wildflowers you'll see here on the lazy summer days. And I think that's all, but it's not over yet because we've got the late bloomers coming, and we'll be doing that workshop here in about 5 weeks. So stay tuned. That is the end. But before I stop sharing, I just wanted, because I've got a couple of slides, people always ask the question of where to go to learn things, and maybe everyone on here has heard the answer to that enough times. But I put these here because they're all three useful, and I know there are a lot of online resources, but sometimes people like to, go primitive, and actually take a field book with you. One in the center is the one I learned on many, many years ago. Newcomb's Guide is probably a little bit better for some of this the prairie savanna flora, but they're both good guides to start with. You're just starting out and just trying to get the basics down for plant ID. They're both good places to start, just a step up from that in terms of its complexity of it, but also its coverage is Kane County Wild Plants of Natural Areas, a really good text that's really thorough and something you'll take a next step to graduate to that after starting with the picture books, and before you might go to something like Flora of the Chicago region, where you really need to know your technical keys for that. But with that, I will. I think that's it. I think. Oh, and here I put. Now I know there are lots of other apps. I find myself using these too often because they give me good descriptions of the plants. I key something out. And Flora of the Chicago region is a little bit weak on its technical descriptions of the plant and the whole flower. And I go to these two sources to get a description of the plant, whether the bracts are fuzzy beneath or not. And so, if it's useful to me, I thought it might be useful to somebody else. So Illinois Wildflowers and Minnesota Wildflowers are two sources. And when you start looking at the pictures, you'll see that I swiped some of the pictures from them. So, questions. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes. I apologize. I guess I should apologize for going quickly. My choice was to do 20 plants slowly or to do 65 plants quickly. And I thought trying to get through them, show them to you, make the recording available, give you the PDF afterward, and give you the other sources would in total allow you to learn more than if I just focused on 25 plants and went really slowly. So I know for those of you who are just starting, I went pretty quickly, but hopefully you got something from that. Go through it again on the PDF and the recording, and and you can always email a question to me or email it to Jackie or ask it right now, even better.
Our first question in the chat. Could you show those websites again, please?
Okay. I have to remember how to.
We also have a list of sort of book and website recommendations I can include when we send out the PDF or the presentation.
And these are the books I show are really ones that I use that were really important to me, both when I was learning plants and when I was starting to teach plants, and people started asking for resources there in the early 90s. And frankly, these two internet sources are ones I repeatedly go to them over and over and over again, so I felt they might be useful to you.
Hello, Tom.
Yes.
This is Amy.
Hi,
You
Amy.
taught some great classes at Morton Arboretum.
Oh,
Unbelievably
you're that Amy.
deep.
I remember
I
you.
am that Amy. I am that Amy. So I followed today's presentation and found that it was a wonderful updated review, particularly because plants have been recategorized, right?
Yeah.
So that was really helpful. I am continue to stay involved with informational things such as Plant Clinic. And so this is so helpful and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And your last name is Westerhold, isn't it?
Westerhold, yes.
You see, it's funny how you remember things. I can't remember
Well-
people's names that I met yesterday. I can't remember. But
Well,
something
we
like
had good-
this, bingo. Anyway, thank
Tom.
you. Thank you.
Your super presentations, and it's tremendously great to have it online to go back to and see the depth of instruction you've given over the years.
So
a real-
now you know how many things I got wrong in the early 90s.
I don't remember anything wrong. I was always impressed.
Okay.
Thanks again.
All right.
Got a couple of questions in the chat for you. Are
Okay.
yellow and white avens the same other than variation in color?
Yellow and white avens. Trying to remember them by the common name. There's white avens. Well, white avens is yeah, they're two different. White avens is the Geum canadensis. That's the common plant of woodlands, and the yellow. I'm trying to remember now. I'd have to go back through it.
I think it's Geum alepicum for
The
yellow.
Geum alepicum, those are prairie plants and growing. Yeah, they're very different plants. Same genus, but different species.
What's the best conservation area to observe right now? Do you have a favorite?
I don't know. Right now, you're getting, in the early spring, the recommendation is always coral woods because the sugar maple understory and much of there in the shade and relative lack of grazing and disturbance. So it's got a rich spring flora. By this time of year, Glacial Park, walking, walking the prairie restorations and around the open savannas are always good. I don't know. I would ask for other people's recommendations on that one. Put it in the chat now to places to go to see things coming into bloom. Now, I tend to frequent the same places over and over and over again, both from my phenology route and just by virtue of kind of what my job is. So if you've got a favorite places this time of year, why don't you put it quickly in the chat session and Jackie can read it out.
I'll take a moment too, just to put in a plug for Phenology Volunteer Program, because we do have volunteers that go out and basically are recording the start bloom and end bloom for flowers. So that's kind of why we picked this topic. We teach people how to look for things that are blooming when we record the dates, and Tom has been comparing that to temperature and rain data and trying to see if there's some long-term trends. So that's the basis of where this is going, but that's usually one of our summer field seasons. So if you choose to do that, you go back to the same site every couple of weeks and watch everything come alive. So that's kind of cool.
Definitely. We're still looking for more volunteers. We got a lot of them, but we're still looking for more. And as we get more volunteers, we can bring more areas under observation.
That's all the questions in the chat for now. Anybody else want to add? We have a couple more minutes here. You can unmute and ask your question as well.
Did anyone put any places in the chat session? Places to observe flowers?
Nope.
Okay.
But we do have quite a few sites. There's a lot of options. It's really hard to narrow it down.
Well, anywhere you get open fields and prairies, they're in prime condition at this time of, or coming into prime condition. The prairies will keep going, and even more things will be coming into flower as we go later into the summer. And we'll talk about those in our next workshop. I'm finding Glacial Park pretty exciting this time of year. Just walking around there, seeing new things all the time. It's like seeing old friends every year, you know, they come back.
Got a recommendation for Peck Farm Prairie in Geneva.
That sounds good, yeah.
Had several thank yous. So thank you. Oh, another recommendation, Bliss Woods for woodland plants.
That's something else I should have ready for the next workshop. Someone will ask me, where should I go? I remembered some resources this time, but
It's all right. It always changes depending on where people are near to. So. All right. Well, I think that's about it for the questions. So you can wrap up, Tom.
okay. Well, thank you for coming today. It's always fun to do these. It's educational for me to put the presentations together because, believe it or not, I don't remember everything. And going back through the presentations and like that sequence of fruits in the rose family, I had no intention of doing that. I just piqued my interest after a couple of them, and it sort of clicked. And then the more I started looking, the more I started seeing, and probably were another half dozen I could have put in there. That to me is just the amazing part of learning about plants and plant evolution, is how the same part can be used for so many different purposes, and you can start off with the same structure and create these incredibly different forms later on. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for coming today, and I'll look forward to seeing you again for our next workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you.